All right, hey guys. So I am currently inspired to make another video about Reasoning Gate Turbo, my favorite deck in GOAT format by a mile, and probably my favorite deck of all time. I just played this deck again at YCS Las Vegas at the Ultimate Time Wizard event, and I had a really good run with it. It worked really well. I've been loving my build. I haven't really changed it too much in quite some time. And I was playing it, and I've learned a lot of things over the years. I've been playing this deck for a long time, and I've learned a lot of like little tips and tricks for how to play this deck and maximize its output despite the fact that it has a lot of inherent RNG properties, a lot of inherent randomness because you're playing Reasoning and Monster Gate. And I've just learned a lot of ways to kind of mitigate the randomness and swing things slightly in your favor. And if you're playing against an opponent who doesn't really know the deck too well, then these slight optimizations can really add up. In general, I think that this deck gets a bad rap. I totally understand if you don't like playing combo decks in GOAT format. That's totally valid. I'm not trying to convince anyone to play combo in GOAT, but I think this deck gets a really bad rap for being very luck-based, very sacky, and I'm not trying to say that it can't be sacky. For sure, if you have the nuts, it's just completely oppressive, and there's not too much counterplay you can do. But there are plenty of times where you don't open the nuts, or you're still assembling your combo, and getting from point A to B, B being where you can finally do your combo, and making the right decisions along the way, I think makes all the difference between a bad Reasoning Gate player and a good Reasoning Gate player. And I think there's a lot of, again, small little tweaks you can do between points A and B where you can maximize your chances of winning with this deck despite the inherent randomness. So I think this deck gets a really bad rap for being super sacky and super luck-based. I think it gets a bad rap for not taking too much skill or not having to be a very good, pilot to play this deck. And I am in no way trying to say that this deck is, for example, more skillful than Warriors or Go Control or Chaos Turbo or any other deck. I'm not trying to say that. All I'm trying to say is that I think there is more skill that goes into piloting this deck correctly than people give it credit for. And I think a lot of people don't spend enough time playing this deck to understand some of the intricacies and nuances and small decisions that you need to make to fully enjoy playing this deck. Because for sure, you got the bread and butter combo. Everyone knows that one. I'll go over it in the video. But it's all of the, game states where you don't have that bread and butter combo that are really important. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about things like the main combos of the deck. I'll give the rundown of, the basic combos and more advanced combos. I'll talk about how to leverage Reasoning and Monster Gate in the most effective way possible from my experience. I'll talk about how to leverage some other cards in the best way possible, and then I'll just give a whole bunch of other small tips for playing this deck. I'm not going to talk about side decking at all in this video. If this video does well, I'll do a separate video that's about side decking. I just think that your side deck it's a very personal thing. It's based a lot about your play style. It's based a lot on your specific build, obviously. It's based a lot on the information you have about your opponent and what they're going to side in against you or likely to side in against you. So it's just very hard to make a very generic, comprehensive side deck video. But if this video does do well, I'll make another in-depth video about how I side for different matchups. But with that, let's just get into the deck. So I'll start off with, the most bread and butter combo that you're trying to do with this deck, which, if you know anything about this deck, you're probably already familiar with it. But essentially, this is a chaos-based deck where you're trying to set up one of your chaos monsters, either BLS or Sork, which means that you need a light and a dark in the graveyard, and you are getting things into the graveyard via these two cards, Reasoning and Monster Gate. Reasoning, basically you activate it and your opponent calls a level, and if they get the level incorrect and the monster is normal summonable, then you special summon it to your field. So that means that monsters that are not normal summonable, like the Chaos monsters, if they called 6, for example, it would skip past Chaos Sorcerer because you can't normal summon it and go on to the next monster that is normal summonable. So that's reasoning. And Monster Gate is similar, but you're tributing a monster and you keep milling monsters until you hit a monster that is normal summonable, and then you special summon it. So both of them are helping you cycle through your deck, milling spells and milling traps and milling monsters that can't be normal summoned and digging into your monsters that can be normal summoned. So basically you're setting up your light and dark for your chaos monster, and then you're going to activate Dimension Fusion, which has the effect of pay 2,000, and both players special summon as many banished monsters as possible. So the main combo is you're just trying to hit DMOC. You're just always trying to hit DMOC off of Monster Gate or Reasoning. And DMOC is going to help you put together your combo, because it's basically a toolbox thing where you mill a whole bunch of spells, and then DMOC will be able to add back whichever spell, whichever combo piece you're missing. But the idea is you would get DMOC on the field, try to get Dimension Fusion into your hand, and have a light and the dark in the graveyard. You would special summon your Chaos monster by banishing light and dark, and then you would activate Dimension Fusion to bring them back. And you know, when Crane is brought special summoned, you get to draw one, and ideally the dark that you're bringing back is Jinzo, because you're shutting off your opponent's traps, and you're just trying to sorry for the noise, and you're just trying to OTK them this way, right? Ideally, if you want, like, this is like the very basic combo, but ideally you're in a state where you also have your DMOC banished, because when this leaves the field, it gets banished. So you can, you know, extend the combo by, you know, you drop DMOC, add Dimension Fusion back to your hand, and use an extender like Monster Gate or Metamorphosis, something that gets the DMOC off of the field and banished. So say you activate Monster Gate, and then you Monster Gate into, say, your Zaborg, and then you drop your Chaos monster to banish light and dark, and then you activate Dimension Fusion. This time around, you're bringing back DMOC as well as the light and the dark, and then you can OTK more easily this way. And you can also use DMOC's effect again to add something back from your graveyard. Often it's going to be something like Lightning Vortex or whatever you need for the situation. So that is the bread and butter combo. Next, I'll show, I'll just talk a little bit about how to abuse DMOC. It's also another pretty basic combo, but you need to be aware of this if you want to leverage this deck to the maximum. And you're basically always trying to get the most value out of DMOC. You want this card in circulation as quickly as possible, and then, you know, try to maximize its value. So in general, if you hit DMOC, you obviously add your spell, and you usually want to wait for your opponent to out this card, to waste a resource on this. And when they do finally get rid of it, it's going to get banished, and it's going to be in a spot where it's queued up, locked and loaded, ready for Dimension Fusion to get it back. But there are situations where you're going super aggro and you just have the nuts and you need a way to put more bodies on the board. So it could be something like maybe your hand is something like this, or maybe it's just like this with a Dimension Fusion in the graveyard, or maybe some other extender like that. So pretend that Dimension Fusion and Metamorphosis are in the graveyard, pretend that these are in your hand, and pretend that you've just hit a DMOC off of Reasoning or Monster Gate. So you can do something like add back the Metamorphosis. This is assuming that you're not afraid of back row or any disruptions, but then you can, you know, Monster Gate your DMOC away, pretend that you hit like a Jinzo or something like that, and then you can Dimension Fusion your DMOC back. DMOC activates, you can add your Dimension Fusion back to your hand. You can Metamorphosis this DMOC into Gatling Dragon, which I should have already prepared, but I am unprepared. Where's my Gatling Dragon? Here it is. And then you can Dimension Fusion back again. So this is the second time you're activating Dimension Fusion. You need to have life points for this, obviously. But then you're going to get DMOC's effect again, and maybe you get something like a pre-mat to reborn a monster or something else. Or maybe you even get back Metamorphosis again and make a second Gatling Dragon and just go and, you know, clear your opponent's whole field, right? But the main point I'm trying to say here is that you should definitely be looking for opportunities to loop and abuse this DMOC. And if you have, Dimension Fusion plus an extender like Monster Gate or Metamorphosis, you can easily make multiple Gatling Dragons and loop the fuck out of DMOC and abuse it to the maximum. So that's the second set of combos I kind of wanted to talk about, looping DMOC. Next up, we have True Nade, because True Nade facilitates some really important combos in this deck. They're very simple, but it's always good to be looking out for them. And it involves True Nade and Call and Premature, Jinzo, DMOC, Sacred Crane, things like that. Okay, so True Nade, obviously good in this deck for clearing the back row and making sure you can land your combos, but it's also very good with Pre-Mat and Call. In case you're unaware, Pre-Mat, when this leaves the field, when this bounces back to your hand, the monster still stays on the board, which is very important because you could do something like Pre-Mat, get Crane, draw one, and then Call of the Haunted, get the Pre-Mat back to your hand and activate, Giant True Nade, get the Pre-Mat back to your hand, activate the Burial again for a second monster, which is pretty neat. You can also obviously do that with DMOC. You can Premature, get the DMOC, add a spell, True Nade back to your hand, and activate it again. That's all great. And the second thing I want to call out is on this same combo. You got to be careful when you're doing this and how greedy you want to be. Sometimes you are forced to activate the True Nade first just to guarantee that your Pre-Mat is going to connect. Say, for example, you have DMOC in the grave and you're trying to Pre-Mat it back, and you have these both. You could get super greedy right here and try to Pre-Mat, your Crane or your DMOC back first. But if your opponent has like an MST or Reggae Break, they're not going to let you do that, and you're going to be screwed. So it's probably just best to activate the True Nade first just to guarantee that this Pre-Mat is going to resolve. So just be aware of that. And the other combo is with True Nade and Call. So a lot of times, you'll have a Crane in the graveyard, and having a Crane in the graveyard with Call on the field is very favorable because if your opponent Heavy Storms, True Nades, or MST this, you can chain it to bring back your Crane and draw one, since it is mandatory. Keep in mind that DMOC is not a mandatory effect. It is an optional effect, so you cannot do the same thing for Call, for DMOC. If your opponent Heavy Storms while you have DMOC in the grave, you cannot chain, well, you can chain Call the Haunted, and you're not gonna be able to trigger a DMOC because it'll miss timing. So just keep in mind that fact. It's really important actually when you're deciding to use Call the Haunted when you have DMOC in the grave. Say you got DMOC into your grave this turn and then you set Call the Haunted. There's a couple situations here. You can, right in their draw phase or standby phase, preemptively fire this Call the Haunted to get back DMOC, and you probably have your highest chances of resolving this at that point in time because they specifically need to have, MST or Dust Tornado to prevent you from doing this in their draw phase. Or you could get greedy and kind of, wait a little bit and then try to resolve this later on, either later on their turn or during your turn. But then you just give them more opportunities to stop this, like if they Heavy Storm you or if they set a Dust Tornado or something like that. So typically, if I have the DMOC Call the Haunted set up, I'll just rip this Call of the Haunted as soon as I can in their draw phase to guarantee the DMOC's gonna, or not guarantee, but increase the chances of the DMOC resolving. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is Call of the Haunted and Giant True Nade. This is a very, straightforward combo, but it's very important. If you get Jinzo in the grave with Call on the field, that is so powerful, because if Call the Haunted brings back Jinzo, Jinzo will negate Call's effect. So if Call ever leaves the field, whether it's destroyed or whatever, your Jinzo is going to stay. So you can get in a situation where you've got your Jinzo in the grave, maybe they called reasoning correctly, and you set Call, and you can bait out their traps and chain Call to bring back Jinzo, or wait for them to Heavy Storm at MST or Call and then just bring back Jinzo, and it'll stay on the field even if Call dies, which is really cool. And if you get even luckier, you'll have Call with True Nade, and you're going to want to set up a situation where you're able to negate your opponent's traps, right? So you can activate Call, and then wait for them to use something like Regeki Break or Ring or something like that, and then chain your call to bring back the Jinzo. Jinzo will negate that. They'll go neg on that, and you'll get this call back to your hand. And this call will be, again, able to bring back the Jinzo in a follow-up turn, which is very, very, very powerful. You can let them, either try to get rid of your Jinzo with like Exiled Force or something, or if you're going, super spicy and you're not afraid of back row, you can tribute the Jinzo for something like a Zaborg, or maybe, tribute the Jinzo for something like a Zaborg, pop their monster, attack for 24 direct, and set this call again. And once again, you're in a very commanding spot where, any traps that they set are going to be shut off by Jinzo. You can wait till they set back row, end phase, get the Jinzo back, and really, lock them out like that. So that's basically all I have to say about Call and Trunade. Just keep in mind, if you do the combo with Crane, Crane doesn't negate Call of the Haunted, so the Crane will get you the draw, but it will die after the Call of the Haunted leaves the field, whether it's destroyed or bounced back to your hand. Okay, so those are the combos with Trunade. I think the next thing I want to talk about is how to effectively use Reasoning and Monster Gate. And this is going to be the main insight that I communicate in this video, because this is like knowing how to use these two cards correctly really makes or breaks the game, and really separates the good Reasoning Gate players from the bad ones. And it's partially dependent on your build and your play style for sure, but I think there are some tips that I really want to go over that everyone should be aware of to make sure that you're getting the most value out of these cards. So most people know how to use these cards in a really basic fashion. Obviously, you're going to be wanting to use Monster Gate in conjunction with Scapegoat because you're tributing the tokens and you want plus off the tokens. So you use Monster Gate with Scapegoat. That's very obvious. A lot of people, I think, struggle with when to use Reasoning, though. For example, if your opening hand has, a Reasoning or multiple Reasonings, you may be wondering whether or not you should be, using Reasoning right off the bat, or you should be holding them. And I'm going to give some tips for, when you would do either. So generally with this deck, if you're going first and you're opening Reasonings, you generally don't want to be using them. You generally want to just dig deeper and see more cards before you decide when to fire these off. And you obviously can't attack on the first turn, so you're not really doing too much by getting a monster on the board. Furthermore, you might also have Jar of Greeds in your hand, so if you hit Jinzo, you're turning them off. The only risk of not activating them really is that you might take some damage next turn from your opponent, or the worst case scenario, they have Donzalug or Spirit Reaper and you've left an open board for them to rip cards out of your hand. But in general, you're gonna want to be digging deeper into your deck and holding onto your Reasonings until you assemble more of your combo pieces. Things like Dimension Fusion, Chaos Sorcerer, Premat, Call of the Haunted, stuff like that. Usually the best opening hand in this deck is Scapegoat and Jar of Greed. That is like by far the most appealing opening hand when I play this deck, because you could set both of them. You can bait out Heavy Storm. They're both chainable, and you're setting yourself up for a good spot, and your opponent's going neg off that, right? So generally, you're going to be wanting to hold this Reasoning, but there are a few scenarios that I'll describe where you might want to just fire this Reasoning. Okay, scenario 1 is when you have a Crane in your hand, something like this. So generally, if anyone is familiar with this deck, at least a basic level, my recommended guidance is typically with 0 information, meaning they're playing Reasoning Gate, but they haven't milled any cards, they haven't played any cards, they've only played Reasoning right off the bat. Generally with 0 information other than that, I would recommend to call 4, because most Reasoning Gate decks are playing either 2 or 3 Sacred Cranes, which are level 4, and assuming they're not playing the Cyberstein version, right? But assuming they're playing this Chaos version, I would recommend calling 4 just because you're at least twice as likely to correctly hit this. My guidance changes when there is more information. For example, if the graveyard has things like these power spells already set up in the graveyard and they activate reasoning, you'll have to weigh your options and you might think that calling 8 is more important. A lot of times in that situation, the opponent will call 8 and it's actually going to be 4 and I'll go plus off the crane, but it's totally valid call because it's quite possible that if I hit 8, the game is just over since I have these cards that I can recur off of DMOC. So you really got to ask yourself, if hitting DMOC is game breaking, then you have to call 8. If it's not game breaking, then I would recommend calling 4. The other situation is when you have a lot of traps and you can't afford the reasoning gate player to hit Jinzo, then maybe you're forced to call 6. But generally, no information, reasoning gate ripped raw, I would recommend calling 4. So with that in mind, and again, this assumes that the opponent has some basic understanding of the deck and what it's trying to do. With that in mind, anytime I have an opening hand when I have Crane, I am way more likely to just rip the reasonings. I'm not necessarily talking about first turn, but I'm just talking about in general, when I have a Crane in my hand, like maybe I'm going second right here with this hand, I am way more likely to call reasoning because my opponent should be calling 4. And at this point, since one Crane is in my hand, you know, I have a high chance of hitting something that isn't, a higher chance of hitting something that isn't 4 if I just rip this reasoning right away. So that would be scenario 1. If you have Crane in your hand, I would try to activate the reasoning, especially when there's no information, right? Another scenario is like you can manipulate. So again, reasoning, very random card, but there's ways to manipulate your opponent into calling the number that you want. So another example would be, let's see here. Maybe I have this and this in my opening hand. So maybe it's like something like that. Yeah. So in this, actually, let's just replace this with some other random thing like that. Okay, so again, normally the opponent should be calling 4 with no information, but maybe you influence their decision by activating power spells first, like Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity. That's the ideal situation, but if you activate these two and your opponent sees these in the grave, they're going to be a lot more inclined to call 8 because they don't want you to recur these. Right? So what I'm trying to say is like there's ways to influence what your opponent is going to call. If you have these in your hand, you're probably going to want to activate these first before the reasoning so that your opponent is a lot more likely to call 8, and then you're way more likely to resolve reasoning because, you know, 4 you're running two level 4s, right? So that's the other thing I wanted to say. Try to look for situations where you can influence your opponent to call the number that you want. So I've already kind of talked about like you have Crane in your hand and you're trying to get them to call 4 and you want them to call 4 because, you know, there's only one Crane left in deck. And this one where, you know, you're trying to get them to call 8, this becomes even more relevant when, for example, you already have the DMOC in your hand. There's plenty, where is my DMOC? There's plenty of times where you open the DMOC and you don't want to let them know that you have this in your hand because they're gonna call 8, right, at some point. So let's say this is let's say your hand is something like this. So again, most players, no information, no grave setup, you activate reasoning, they're gonna call 4 right away. If your hand is this and you have a Crane in your hand, I would highly recommend trying to give them the information that you have this Crane in your hand or that it's not in the deck at least. And you can do that by normal summoning it. You can do that by using Graceful Charity and getting it into the grave. But as soon as they see this Crane in the grave and they know there's only one left in the deck, at that point in the time, they're more likely to call 8 than they were before they knew this Crane was out of the deck, right? So that's really great for you, especially if you have the DMOC in your hand, because you're going to activate this reasoning. They're going to see this Graceful and this Crane in the grave, and they're going to be like, I don't want you to hit DMOC. I'm going to call level 8, and then you're going to get reasoning to resolve in your favor. So that's also really, really important to know. You could be in a situation where you activated Graceful and you pitched DMOC, and you'll have to weigh whether or not that's favorable for you. Obviously, if you have Dimension Fusion and Sork, this is what you're going to want to do. But if you don't, and you just have a handful of reasonings, you probably don't want to let them know that Demok is no longer in the deck. Okay, along the same lines, I just want to talk about, like, there are situations where you're essentially using reasoning as a foolish burial, and you want your opponent to call the number correctly. Say, for example, you have a Demok in the grave already, and you have, you know, the combo in your hand, something like that. In this scenario, like, and just pretend you have a sweeper like Heavy Storm. In this scenario, you actually want your opponent to call 4 correctly, because that's going to set up your combo, right? So just keep that in mind, that like you want to be looking out for situations where like you don't care if they call the reasoning correctly, because you want the monster in the grave, especially if you have a premature burial or the Call of the Haunted that you're trying to set up. So again, you're trying to look for ways to bait your opponent into calling the right or the wrong number, and you just got to be aware that sometimes you actually want them to call it right. Okay, that's pretty much all oh, that's not even true. Sorry, I have more to talk about. Reasoning and Monster Gate, and having both of these in your hand at the same time, and which ones to activate first or second. So hopefully, like, now that I've explained some thought process about how to use reasoning correctly, that will influence how you go about playing the hands when you have both reasoning and Monster Gate. Typically, like I said, no information, everything's still in the deck. If you just rip this reasoning, they're going to call 4 and have a higher chance of getting that correctly. So in that note, sometimes I will activate the Monster Gate, you know, first, because you're more likely to hit Crane than anything else. You get Crane, and then at this point in time, they're less likely to call Crane, level 4, since they just saw it come out of the deck, and more likely to call something else like 8 or 6. So you can see how the sequencing of these two things, of these two cards, will directly impact what your opponent is more or less likely to call, again, if they know how the deck functions. You should think about when you're doing that when you're doing this. Usually, again, I'll try to, you know, orchestrate these situations where things are in most favor for me to resolve the reasoning correctly. Okay, so another thing is like when to activate Pot of Greed in relation to the Monster Gate and reasoning. Generally, I think the move is to activate Pot of Greed right off the bat to see more cards, and that will help you make your decisions better. And then also, if you do get lucky with a Monster Gate to hit Demok, your Greed is in the graveyard to recur. But also, so if you have like Monster Gate and Greed, I think you generally want to activate the Greed first to have in the grave to set up for the Demok. But if you have Monster Gate and Reasoning, you might be asking yourself, you know, in which order to do these things. And again, it depends on what's in your hand, what's left in the deck, etc. But pretending like all the monsters are left on the deck, generally I'll want to activate the Pot of the Greed to try to dig into the Crane just to pull it out of the deck, because that will increase my chances of my opponent calling Reasoning incorrectly. A lot of times what will happen, since there's 2 Cranes and double the chance of any other level, is like Crane will be the top card in my deck. I'll activate Reasoning, they'll call 4, they'll mill it. I haven't milled any cards, you know, I went neg off of that, and it's really bad for me. Whereas if I activated the Pot of Greed first and drew into the Crane and then activated Reasoning, then they're still probably going to call 4 because they don't see anything in the grave yet, and I'll have a higher chance of resolving Reasoning correctly. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say about Monster Gate and Reasoning. Actually, maybe the only thing left I'll say is, like, since I'm playing, actually, I'll just have a whole section about how to play Serpent. Okay, so actually, let's talk about that right now. I am playing Sinister Serpent in this deck. Why am I playing Serpent in this deck? Because over the years, as I've played this deck, the situation that I've often found myself in is I've wasted my resources and I've tried to push, or my push was interrupted via Solemn Judgment or some other reason, and I have no more gas and my hand size is low because this is a combo deck, and I'm just top decking. And then I'll be top decking into things like Monster Gate, Monster Reincarnation, or Metamorphosis, and like have no way to activate these cards. Crane is obviously a recurring resource that comes back every turn and ensures that you can activate any of these cards if you top deck them. Furthermore, if you get Crane early, I would recommend, just getting the most value out of the Crane, which means things like activating Monster Gate or Metamorphosis early on, even if you don't necessarily need to, just to make sure that you're getting the most value out of your Crane, and you'll get it back next turn. Of course, this depends if you're trying to mitigate against Delinquent Duo. You might want to hold this in your hand if you think that's a threat. But generally, I'm trying to extract the most value out of Crane as possible. And I find that this card just has so many purposes in this deck. And I'll explain a little bit of my theory of why, even though this seems like a silly card to put in this type of deck, why I think it's actually worth it. So first of all, let me talk about some of the utility of Crane other than, converting these cards. It's really nice, especially post side, because your opponent's going to be taking out their noblemen. So you can basically just keep setting this, every turn. It's pretty good against warriors. It could potentially save you 2,000 life points of damage if you just keep setting this. So it's nice to have that card for that purpose. There's been plenty of times where my opponent will have a spell canceller or a last warrior, and I'll just keep continuously setting this and blocking attacks until I draw it out to one of those cards. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. The only other thing I wanted to talk about is that you need to play, if you're playing this in your deck, you need to play this deck with this card in mind, because of course hitting this off of Monster Gate could be very bad if you do this at the wrong time. So you're generally only going to be wanting to activate Monster Gate when you're in a situation where it's okay if you hit Crane, meaning that you have a way to convert it. You have a Metamorphosis, you have a tribute monster like Zaborg or Jinzo. Generally you only want to activate Monster Gate when Crane is not in your deck anymore, or you have a way to convert it. Because if you do it and you tribute for Zaborg, that feels so great, you get Crane back next turn. And Crane also makes your Monster Gate worse, that's for sure. But it makes your Reasoning Gate a little bit better because it's just another level that your opponent is not likely to call. And so Reasoning Gate's better, Monster Gate's worse. Having this in your deck, having more monsters in your deck that aren't light or dark, definitely slows down the deck because you'll be milling less cards in between your Monster Gates and Reasonings because it's going to be interrupted. So you got to keep that in mind as well. That's a big part of the reason why I run triple Chaos Sork, because I go through less of the deck less quickly given my higher monster count. But the only time, I want to kind of assuage people's worries about running Crane in this deck. Really, there's only one scenario where having Crane in this deck is completely game breaking, and that is specifically when Crane is higher up in the deck, closer to you than your DMOC, and Crane is the monster in the deck right before the DMOC. So pretend Crane is right over this DMOC, and you activate Monster Gate, and then you hit this Crane off the Monster Gate, whereas if you didn't run this card, you would have hit the DMOC instead. Only in that situation is this really game breaking, and only then would I be really upset that I was playing this card in my deck. But again, you need to play your Monster Gates in preparation for hitting this Sacred Crane, or at least in situations where it's not going to be completely, game breaking. So that's really the only situation where I think having Crane hinders you. But for all the reasons I already mentioned, I think having Crane is just such a big asset for this deck. I really can't stress that enough. Okay, so now I'm going to talk really quickly about how to use Scapegoat. There's not too much to talk about here, but it is important to note. Again, obviously you're using Scapegoat with your Monster Gates and your Metamorphosis, but you just have to be aware, not even a good player, like a player who knows how this deck functions. If you just set this card as your only back row and they have, MST or Dust Tornado set, they're going to snipe this just on the spot immediately, just guaranteed. Because they know that the only thing that you're really setting usually is Scapegoat and Jar of Greed. And there's situations where if they snipe your Scapegoat, you just lose on the spot. Like the hands where you have For example, double Monster Gate, or Monster Gate and metas, and you need this Scapegoat to make these live. This is the situation where you have one of two options. You either just activate the Scapegoat raw and just summon the tokens, just to guarantee that it goes off. I don't like that because you run the risk of your opponent being able to clear them next turn with Tribe, or just running over all of them or whatever, especially with double spies running around. Or your other option is to set this card alongside a bluff. So I also don't love this option because you're committing more cards to the field than you need to be. But for example, if your opponent has one back row and it's Dust Tornado or MST, and you set two, already they're way less likely to snipe your back row. More aggressive players will snipe and take the 50-50 shot anyway, but more reserve players will not waste their MST. Whereas if you just set one, they're almost guaranteed to hit that. Set two, and they're significantly less likely. Set three, and a really aggressive player will still snipe a back row, but they'll be way less likely to, right? So I just want to make you cognizant of the fact that sometimes when Scapegoat is like your main lifeline or main way to play your hand, you have to do everything in your control to make sure that this resolves properly. Also, I noticed a lot of people hold the Scapegoat when, for example, the opponent is attacking with double spy. I think you generally want to prioritize protecting your life points early on as much as possible. This is one of those decks where having the protecting life points early is very, very important to facilitate your Dimension Fusion play later on. And if you could protect 2,400 life points from 2 spy attacks early with Scapegoat, that's going to be very, very important. So you'll have to decide about how many tokens you want to still be on the field after your opponent attacks and how much life points you want to save, but keep that in mind. And there's also situations where you want your opponent to clear your tokens. Like say you activate this when they have double spy, they clear 2 tokens. 2 is a really good spot for you because you still have enough tokens that you can convert with Metamorphosis and Monster Gate, but you still have enough space on the board after you convert those tokens to do your full combo, because your full combo is going to need you to have 3 spots open, 3 monster slots open. So 2 Scapegoat tokens is generally where I want the sweet spot of how many tokens I want to be left on my turn. Conversely, if you're playing against this deck, I would caution you against clearing any of your opponent's Scapegoat tokens. Like if you're playing against Reasoning Gate, I would caution against clearing the tokens, because for the exact reason of you want their board to be locked up so that they can't do the full combo. I would generally say, if you can't clear all the tokens, or you can't clear at least 3 or 4 of them, I would probably leave them on the board to at least guarantee that your opponent's not going to be able to drop the full combo on you. For sure, they have tokens to convert for Meta and Monster Gate, but even if you leave only 2 tokens, you're still going to have 2 tokens to convert for Meta and Monster Gate. So it doesn't really make a difference. So a lot of people don't know this when they're playing against this deck. They just autopilot and they just clear the tokens, as many as possible, but there's many situations where clearing the tokens actually helps me as the Reasoning Gate player. Okay, now I want to talk about Metamorphosis, which is one of my favorite parts of this deck. I think this deck is super unique in that it's pretty much the only deck, or one of the only decks, that can make almost all of the relevant fusion monsters. The only one that you can't really make is Master of Oz, I would say. And the only other deck that can do that is any deck that's running Cyberstein. But this deck is cool because you can make multiple fusion monsters in a single game, whereas Cyberstein, usually you can only make 1 fusion monster per game and use Cyberstein's effect once. So Metamorphosis has a very important and unique role in this deck. It is a very toolbox card and can help you navigate the situation depending on the monsters that you have available. Obviously, each of the monsters in the deck can turn into a relevant fusion monster target. And then I already explained to you how Metamorphosis can be an extender to get Demok off the field so that you can bring it back with Dimension Fusion. And I'll talk a little bit more about this other purpose in a second. So let's just go through the different monsters that you can make. Starting us off with the most common monster that you're going to make, or one of them, Thousand Eyes. You can make this off of Scapegoat and Metamorphosis or Sinister Serpent. A lot of times in the early game, if you have a slow start, you're going to kind of be forced to make 1,000 eyes and, you know, take your opponent's set cards to prevent them from gaining advantage from things like Spy and Magician of Faith. So usually you can just make this to kind of stall out for a few turns and force your opponent to waste resources on this. Something I really like to do is I'll take their monster. First of all, you can take a Spy and then crash into the other face of attack position Spy, and then they can't set another monster next turn without outing 1,000 eyes because you'll be able to take that. Also, I like to do things like take a monster and then let them set another monster, and then you heavy storm. The monster that's equipped to this will die, and then you can take another monster and then maybe tribute this off for a Jinzo or a Zaborg. And you could do a similar thing with Giant Trunate as well, bounce a monster back to their hand. A little bit worse, but similar thing. So 1,000 eyes is, you know, very important in this deck. Comes up a lot, and usually you can just wait until you have a way to convert this, like Jinzo or Zaborg or Monster Gate. So really important card for this deck. I'm kind of going in order of like most common, you know, fusion monsters that you'll make. The next one is for level 8, which comes up with either Demok or Blackluster Soldier. You know, you can summon BLS, you can banish a card, then Metamorphosis it away because it can't attack when you do its banish effect, or you can meta the Demok into Gatling Dragon. This card is very important in this deck because this helps you clear your opponent's face down cards, it helps you clear spies, it helps you clear Scapegoat tokens. So very important card in this deck. Next up we have, I'd say the next most common level that you're going to make is 6, and you're going to do that with usually Chaos Sorcerer, only Jinzo in certain situations. So now it's probably a good time to mention the other really important purpose of Metamorphosis is to facilitate getting a light and dark in the graveyard. So that's usually only the case when you will Metamorphosis your Jinzo to get dark in the graveyard, or if you have like a pre-mat or call that you're going to use to bring the Jinzo back. That's another reason why you would Metamorphosis the Jinzo away. But 6 comes up fairly often, especially when you drop your Chaos Sorcerer and you banish, so it won't be able to attack, and then you can Metamorphosis this away. And the targets that you're going to be making are usually Ryu Senshi is like the #1 target. Really good because cannot be targeted by spells, so your opponent can't Snatch Steal, Brain Control, Book of Moon. They can't use any of those cards on this card, and this card can negate normal traps, so it's really good at stopping your opponent's Raigeki breaks or rings, torrential, mirror force, etc. So it's pretty cool that you can Chaos Sorcerer, banish a card, Metamorphosis into Senshi, and it's effectively like a Jinzo, which is really nice. The next one that comes up pretty often, not often, but sometimes, is Dark Blade. This is the highest attack level 6 that you're running. It's 2200. It's a dark, which is relevant, and this is basically like a Kaiku in that when it does damage, you're going to banish 3 cards from your opponent's grave. This one comes up less often, but if you're in a spot where you cannot OTK and you're afraid that your opponent's going to clap back with a Chaos Monster, you can use this, banish all of their lights or all their darks or whatever, and you know, put them in a spot where it's hard for them to come back. Just keep in mind that it's going to feel Dimension Fusion, and that could backfire. And then the last level 6 that you're ever going to make is Ojama King. This hardly ever comes up, except that this is a light target. It can help you stall out. If your opponent has Scapegoat tokens, you can clog their field and make it so that they can't summon any monsters. I have made this sometimes. It just really hardly ever comes up, but there's very niche situations where this is actually the right card to make. Moving on. Sorry, actually, you know, level 5 might be a little bit more common. No, level 6 is more common. Sorry, because you're only running one level 5. Your level 5 is going to be Zaborg, and the level 5s that you're going to make are either Dark Balter, Fiend Skull Dragon, or Reaper of the Nightmare. So Dark Balter, you're usually making this card. So both of these cards have the ability to stop flip effect monsters. Dark Balter negates the effect of any monster it destroys, so it's good for stopping things like Sangan. It's good for stopping Sinister Serpent because they won't be able to get Serpent back if you kill it with Balter. Stuff like that. DD Warrior Lady, it's not going to work. But they both have 2000 attacks, so they both get walled out by Spy. But the only thing is that, like, Dark Boulder needs to destroy the monster by battle to negate its effect, whereas Fiend Skull Dragon just negates all flip effects. So if you attack it to spy with this, they won't get the second spy. This one's good for its effect is to stop normal spells. So if you think your opponent had, first of all, in the mirror, this is just so good in the mirror. This is like almost as good as playing Spell Canceller in the mirror. If you can make this very early on in the mirror match or any Reasoning Gate based deck, you're just in a very, very good spot. This one is good. Bolter is good because it's dark. So there's sometimes where you need to meta into this to get a light in the dark in the grave. Unfortunately, Fiend Skull Dragon is a wind. I really wish it was a dark, but it's a wind. I make this card specifically against Turbo because this card cannot be targeted by trap cards, so they can't ring this or Raigeki break this. They can't Sakuretsu this if they're playing that, and this negates all flip effects. So really, I make this card when I'm trying to bait my opponent into dropping Chaos Sorcerer specifically. I actually did that in at Vegas this past weekend, where my opponent had one back row and they were kind of saving it, and I kind of just assumed that it was a Raigeki break. And I was in a position where I think I had Dimension Fusion and I wanted them to waste their Chaos Sorcerer on me. And I was well equipped to deal with Chaos Sorcerer if they did drop it. So what I did was I Zaborged their face down monster, and instead of attacking with the Zaborg and maybe risking it getting hit by any kind of trap that targets, I preemptively Metamorphosis it into Fiend Skull Dragon. Their back row ended up being Phoenix Wing Windblast, so it was the correct play. On their subsequent turn, they had to drop Chaos Sorcerer. They didn't have to, but they did because this shuts off all flip effects. And they banished this, and I was in a position, I think I ended up stealing the Chaos Sorcerer with like Brain Control or something, and it ended up being the right move. So sometimes Fiend Skull Dragon is the move. And then the last card is Reaper on the Nightmare. This hardly ever comes up. Like, there's not too many situations where I would be willing to swap out my Zaborg for this card, because you can go neg if they just answer this. But there could be some situations where you need to stall out, or if you're just going very aggressive and you want to like simplify game state and start ripping cards from your opponent's hand, you can think about making this card as well. Okay, and then the least common levels that you're going to be making, or I mean maybe similarly, less common. Next up is 7. It's less common because I hardly ever want to get rid of my 2800 body. I'd rather just let them answer this instead of metamorphosing it. But there are situations where you open this card and you don't have much else, and you have to normal, summon it, normal set it, activate Metamorphosis, and your options here are King Dragoon, Last Warrior, and Twin Headed. So of these three, the one I make the most often is King Dragoon because what's it called? Chaos has a very hard time outing this. They can't use Chaos Sorcerer to target this. They can't use Break, Ring, stuff like that. Really, their only clean outs to this are Mirror Force, Torrential, and Tribe or BLS if they have it set up. But if you can establish this on the board and not summon any more monsters, you're not afraid of Torrential, you can kind of get an idea of that. You can kind of get a read on Mirror Force, and that really just leaves Tribe, unless they have Light and Dark in the grave already, in which case I may or may not make this. But this just puts in a lot of work against Turbo and basically baits out their Tribe early on, which is very good because if they drop it later, when you have a full board, they can easily out your board, especially because Jinzo and Fusilier are both machines, so it's kind of like a 2-for-1 deal. But I'll make King Dragoon, especially in the early game, just to get myself out of that early game. Usually I'm only doing it when I brick and I don't really have a better play. I hardly ever do that when I hit this card off of Reasoner or Monster Gate unless I really need the Dark in the Grave. Okay, next up is, I'll talk about Last Warrior in a second. Next up is Twin Headed. This hardly ever comes up. I don't really know why you would make this over King Dragoon, unless you specifically need the 2800 damage or the light attribute, which could be relevant. If you are making this off of Fusilier, you're pretty much telegraphing to your opponent that you need the light to hit the grave. So they should do everything in their power to prevent this from hitting the grave, because you're you're almost explicitly telling them that you have Chaos Sorcerer, Dimension Infusion in your hand, and you need this light. So it's really a desperation play. And then the last card is the Last Warrior. So if you don't know what this does, when you summon this, it kills all your monsters on your field, and neither player can summon cards, or they could still set, and I'm pretty sure they could still tribute set. But a lot of people, like, if this gets made against a Reasoning Gate player, it's pretty tricky for them. They are then on a 4-turn clock if they can't out this. But honestly, like, I often recommend against making this in the mirror match. It's just that every time my opponent has made this against me, it's backfired on them, just like straight up. Like, I found myself in situations where I have enough monsters to set to keep blocking this, or I have Sinister Serpent to recur, and they can't play the game either because neither person can summon monsters, and then I'll top deck an out, and they've kind of foregone playing the game because they're just trying to win with this card. And then once I finally draw the out, then I usually have a lot of cards in my hand and to work with, and if I could out this, then I could just full combo on them. Or I usually find my way into a Snatch Steal. I know there's only one copy, but you'd be surprised like how often I can stall and then get Snatch Steal, and this just completely backfires on the opponent. And usually when I've made this card, like I've made this card multiple times, first turn against Reasoning Gate, the mirror match, and had it backfire on me. I remember one game, they just had like all the monsters that they could normal summon or set. Like they had like Double Crane and like maybe it was like Cyber Sign or whatever, and I couldn't get in a direct attack with this, and finally they were able to out it, and yeah, it just didn't do anything. So I really recommend against making this card in the mirror, unless specifically you have an out like a trap, like a Ring of Destruction or an MST, or some answer to Snatch Steal, or some contingency plan, like if things don't go your way with this card. Like if you have a way to protect it or deal with your opponent taking it, then I would make this card. But if you're just making this raw open board, like it's very, very, very tempting to do that, but in my personal experience, it's just backfired more times than it's won me the game. So that being said, like sometimes it is the right move, and but I just don't really love making this card, to be honest. Okay, and then the last card that comes up sometimes is Dark Fire Dragon, and you're making that with Sacred Crane, and you're really only making this if you specifically need a Dark in the Grave. So you hit Crane, you get your draw, you Metamorphosis into this, maybe you tribute this for like Jinzo or Zaborg, and now you have like your Light and Dark set up in the grave. So that's really the only reason you would make this. Next, I'll just talk about some really small little tips and tricks to optimize your playing. So generally, where is it? Generally, I think it's a good idea to hold this Graceful Charity in your hand. Of course, there's situations where, you just want to rip this Graceful Charity right away. But just in general, I think you are wanting to draw more cards, see as many cards as possible before you activate your Graceful Charity. Activate your Jar of Greeds before you activate your Graceful Charity. The only real exception to this would be if your hand is not playable, meaning it doesn't have any Reasoning, Monster Gate, Scapegoat, etc. Or if your hand looks something like this, in which case this should just be, auto win. Like, I think Graceful Charity is the best card in this deck, actually. And I think this is the best deck to play Graceful Charity in, just because it facilitates the combo so well. So if you have this hand, obviously you're going to Graceful, you're going to draw 3, you're going to put these 2 in the grave, you're going to Chaos Sorc, banish these 2, activate Infusion, bring these 2 back, maybe add the Graceful or Dimension Infusion back, and draw 1. So in that situation, I would just rip this Graceful right away. And that also brings me to the topic of when to pop off the combo. Sometimes even going first, like this is very obviously a good first turn thing to do. And I would just rip this right away because you don't want to risk your opponent using Delinquent Duo and ripping cards out of your hand, and you want to guarantee that this hits the field. Sure, you're wasting your Chaos Monster a little bit prematurely, but you've already dug deep into your deck. You already have this board that they have to out. You're going to go plus off the Crane, plus off the Democ, and you're going to be in a very favorable position. So there's times where I think you should just rip your combo right away. There's been times where, I've had these two in my hand and I'm holding them, waiting for a more opportunistic time to use them, waiting for a back row sweeper, and then my opponent top decks duo and just rips these two cards out of my hand and I just lose on the spot. Whereas if I was aggressive with them and did this, even if it's like not, game on board at that turn, like it just puts me at such an advantage that it's worth just preemptively using these things. So that's another thing I wanted to say. Another thing I wanted to talk about is Torrential Tribute. There's ways to bait out your opponent's Torrential Tribute, and there's situations where like you actually want your opponent to Torrential Tribute you, or like you never want them to, but there's times where like it's pretty favorable for you. So pretend you have something like you just hit this DMOC, you add this Dimension Fusion back, you summon this BLS, you banish, a light and dark, something like that. Let's just pretend it's like, just to make the situation less obvious, you banish light and dark, something like that. And you can choose priority here when you summon this this BLS. In general, I would recommend banishing the monster after you activate Dimension Fusion, because they're just going to get it back off of Dimension Fusion. But you can do things like your opponent asks you if you call priority. Usually that indicates that they have a response to this, whether it be a ring or a torrential or a Raigeki break. But in the case where you're reading torrential, you can bait them into activating that by saying no priority on the BLS. They might be very tempted to just torrential here on the spot, especially if you have maybe Scapegoat tokens that they want to clear or something else. But if that's the case and they do that, you're really just cooking, because your Dimension Fusion is going to bring back your DMOC and what you just banished for BLS. And this is, in a lot of cases, just game on the board, because you'll usually be able to have some access to another monster, maybe use Premat to bring back your Zaborg. And this is why I run Zaborg, because 24 plus 28 plus 28 is 8k exactly. So my main point is, like, there's situations where you're reading torrential and you're trying to bait out the torrential so that you can secure the game with your Dimension Fusion push. Solemn Judgment. Okay, there's not too many ways to play around Solemn Judgment, other than if you're reading Solemn Judgment, you can kind of have some flexibility to try to bait that one out as well. Usually cards that will bait out Solemn Judgment are, let me just get out all the cards that typically bait out Solemn Judgment. Okay, so I'm not even gonna say this baits it out. Like Heavy Storm, if they have Judgment and like 3 back row or whatever, they're gonna Judgment there for sure. Trunade, a good player is, it's hard, but some players will let the Trunade go through, because generally you don't want to activate Judgment on the Trunade, but that's exactly what I'm saying. Sometimes you can bait out the Judgment with Trunade. Other things like Reasoning and Metamorphosis and Monster Gate, when you're tributing a monster, that's other times where your opponent is likely to use Solemn Judgment, because they're going plus off of that in most situations. And so basically you can kind of influence them to use Solemn Judgment if you have follow-up play after these. And then a lot of times, even Reasoning will bait Solemn Judgment. It's really hard to use Judgment at the right time, but the right time Solemn Judgment against a Reasoning will just, ruin the Reasoning Gate player's turn, just game on the spot, right? So there is the psychological component about when you're playing in life. If you can kind of represent that, hey, I really need this Reasoning to go through, and if this doesn't go through, I lose on the spot, then maybe your opponent is more likely to activate Solemn. If you're just like looking, you can make a whole other video on this topic about how to show body language and represent certain things and whatnot. But if you're just sitting back chilling, you activate Reasoning, you don't even look worried at all, your opponent is going to know that you have follow-up. But if they think that you really need this to resolve, then they're going to be more likely to Judgment. So little things like that, again, help optimize your chances of winning with this deck. Okay, that is all I had for this deck. I could really talk about it for hours. I think this deck is such a cool deck. It's really not a 2005 format deck. Like, this deck is way ahead of its time. You can easily cook decks in Edison format. Like, I feel like this deck operates on the same level as like maybe even Gigavice from Edison format, but it's definitely not a 2005 level deck. It's super overpowered. And I hope you guys enjoyed this, and maybe after watching this video and after me describing a little bit more of the nuances of this deck, I'm hoping you have a little bit of a better appreciation for how this deck plays and how you can play it successfully. All right, thanks for watching. Peace.